I'm one of these theologically unlearned parents that John was talking about earlier. I don't know anything at all about theology, but I do know what I like. Most of my children are at an age where if they attended school, they'd be directly affected by these changes to the sex education curriculum. But because they're home educated, they will be protected from all but the most indirect effects of these changes. In a very practical way, it's the most certain bulwark against the militant sexualisation of children, which is being affected not only through this one subject, but through many others as well. I mean, obviously our focus is always on these the relationships and sexual education curricula, but the fact is it's being brought in through the back door in science and geography as well. On its own, though, home education to avoid school isn't enough. As parents, we should be asking ourselves how we can arm our children for the coming struggle when in their turn they'll emerge from home and they will have to engage as well. Education is in a state of deepening crisis. Teachers complain that many children start school unable even to talk and not potty trained. Other teachers will insist that the point of school is to eradicate the so-called prejudices which have been instilled in children by their parents. The view that many parents are failing so badly at bringing up their own children is the reason why many people think that more unilateral intervention from the state is necessary, and in fact a good thing, a necessary thing. That's a very widely held view. But these two phenomena have their origin in a common source. That is the idea that it is the job of schools, not parents, not only to educate, but also to instill culture and manners. And this is not a new idea. In fact, it was an essential part of the post-war evolution of grammar schools into the top tier of the selective school system. Children from poor backgrounds were to be given an education and culture foreign to their family and background to enable them to move into a different social class. The three-tier educational structure of the 1940s has effectively disappeared, but this well-intentioned educational plan spread the idea, at first applicable to only one group of children, a small group of children, that the job of schools wasn't to pass on parents' values or even to correct those values or place them into a larger context, but systematically to replace those values with completely different ones as a matter of meritocratic social engineering. Insofar as it was successful, it contributed to the situation often recorded in popular culture in the 1950s of parents and adult children who cannot understand each other anymore because the children had not only moved on from the places, pastimes, tastes and attitudes they grew up with, but would even be ashamed of them. The notion of schools as value transplant centres had precedence in the 19th century battles in Italy and France about church involvement in schools, and even earlier in this country when Catholics were forbidden to be school teachers in penal times. But if schools were expected to teach Protestantism, patriotism, or secularism, it was not so much expected in previous eras that schools would be the primary cultural formators of children, that they would overturn or displace the bedtime stories, family relationships and social attitudes which children absorb in the home. Perhaps the closest they came was in attempting to suppress local languages and dialects, which caused irreparable damage to authentic local cultures. But even this project was undertaken in the main for prosaic reasons. In this country at least, up until recently, the good or bad influence of schools and their partial displacement of parents in the formation of children operated in the context of many, if not most parents, having some meaningful choice between schools, but such choice is no longer possible. For years, parents have complained about schools ignoring their wishes and talked about the frustration of trying to effect changes to school ethos and curricula. At the same time, the educational establishment has ensured that variation amongst schools in terms of ethos exists only within a very narrow band. The result is that at present there are almost no schools to which parents can reasonably delegate their authority and sacrifice their primary influence. This isn't to say that doing battle with the educational establishment is unnecessary or pointless. On the contrary, we should constantly keep before us a mental image of the education a truly uncompromising Catholic school would provide, and fight as hard as we can to drag what we do have up to that standard. But this particular war shouldn't be conducted with children on the front line. The immediate question is how we can form our children in the home in such a way as to rebuild the culture of the faith strongly enough that they in their turn can pass it on to their own children. We ask this in the context of the historically normal and indeed sane attitude to the role of home and school. Values are passed on primarily in the home, and insofar as this occurs outside the home, it should be in accord with the values of the home. As I noted at the start, the current crisis is a crisis of family life as well as of schools. The influence of schools is paramount today because of the collapse to such a large extent of the family as an institution capable of forming children, even teaching them their native language and potty training them. Schools have been moving into a vacuum where families ought to have been, even if they have contributed to the creation of this vacuum. What we can't do about schools, we should be able to do about our own families. I know that many parents feel hopelessly inadequate faced with this challenge. We've been systematically disempowered over the course of 60 years. But we should take heart. There's no need to persuade this audience of the colossal mess the establishment has made of the job it has wrested from parents. Mental illness among children is spiralling, and according to figures from the NHS in 2018, 12.8% of children between 5 and 19 have at least one mental disorder, and that's only the diagnosed figures. We can't doubt that this is connected to the relentless diet of a combination of state-sponsored child abuse in the form of sex education, in combination with a total absence of moral formation, or perhaps I might more fairly say the perversion of their moral formation. An upbringing by wild animals would surely be less pernicious than this. We can go further, though, than simply to argue that the strength of the home school is only in the absence of conventional school. Good schools, if we had them, would be good places to play sport and to benefit from teaching from specialists. But contrary to the hopes of some educational theorists, moral education cannot be taught effectively in a school setting. The passing on of values doesn't take place using books and blackboards, or even whiteboards and iPads. It's the daily round, the living of Catholic family life, that this is truly learnt, understood and internalised by children. To express this in another way, values can only be passed on effectively when children can see them instantiated. The values modern schools tell us they want to inculcate in our children, tolerance, mutual respect, intellectual curiosity, these are values which few schools, if any, actually instantiate. Indeed, a more extreme case of do what I say, not what I do, is difficult to imagine. And that is one reason why they fail to inculcate these values. The values of a Catholic home, however, piety, respect, love of family members, purity, love of beauty, orderliness, and discipline, are precisely those which even a very imperfect Catholic family can teach by doing. Children who grow up in a household where these values are reflected in family devotions, in meals eaten together, in daily conversation, in care for one another, in sickness and injury, in outings, in recreations, in the way the home is managed and what it feels like to live in it, will come to understand and internalise those values. Sex education in schools is the natural consequence of the handover of responsibility for the moral education of children from their parents to the state. As the state has made more and more aggressive use of this power, so the home as a place where culture and principles are nurtured and fostered in children has declined. Our job, as I see it as parents, is primarily to create homes which support not only education and moral formation, but also an understanding of family life and its irreplaceable role in society. For many of us, including for me, this means relearning what that role is. Feminism has won such comprehensive victories in the world we live in that the perceptions of almost everyone have been influenced by it. I've registered the births of all my babies in person, and I always ask to be recorded on their birth certificates as housewife. I've been very amused and a bit annoyed by the tactful sympathy with which this is received by registrars. And at least one of them has helpfully drawn my attention to the other less toxic alternatives, such as full-time mother. But I was a bit more scandalised to discover that this attitude, the idea that housewife is a badge of shame, is also shared by many homeschoolers. The list of options for mothers on birth certificates has been quite considerably expanded, I think partly because of this. 20 years ago, the government agency responsible for making this list had a considerably narrower view of the possible categories that mothers might fall into. So one homeschooler I met said she said to the registrar that on no account would she allow herself to be described as a housewife, and she wanted to insist on being described as a full-time mother, but this wasn't on the list. So the registrar, instead of trying to argue and reason with her, surreptitiously entered her occupation on the form as no gainful employment. She caught sight of it on the monitor. Yes, she didn't tell me what happened next. Admitting to housewifery as an occupation is as shameful as confessing to relying on benefits. Women's relinquishment of this title has necessarily entailed the relinquishment of the skills that the housewife traditionally possessed. Skills which, looked at from the point of view of the labour market, are actually similar to the chief executive of a small business: catering, laundering, entertaining, furnishing, repairing, managing the employment of regular or occasional employees, buying and selling. Some of the jobs are quite mundane. Some of them are very creative. It's an employment of a very varied and demanding kind. And the end product, if the work is performed well, isn't simply a satisfactory financial return, but the creation of a happy and comforting environment for the worker's own family, a place of refreshment and rest for both inhabitants and guests. Doing this well, contrary to the assertions of feminists, is difficult. Doing it well in combination with homeschooling is particularly difficult, but it isn't a bolt-on which needs to be squeezed in somehow in between swimming lessons and French. The building of a strong and comfortable Christian home is an essential part of our children's education. When they leave home to enter the final stages of their full-time education or the workplace, they need to be equipped not only to practice their faith unwaveringly and defend it in conversation with their colleagues, but also to build their own Christian homes where their own children can be sustained and equipped in the same way. A Christian education is one which puts purity and beauty, order and discipline at the centre of its curriculum. No doubt, this is the reason, this is just a guess, but I think this must be the reason for the widespread attraction of Catholic homeschoolers to the so-called classical curriculum, which has been developed in America, and which takes as its model the ancient system of grammar, logic and rhetoric. The idea is that it represents a rigorous and systematic formation. In contrast, for example, with the unschooling approach. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but that takes an entirely child-led approach, and that can result in no education at all, because if you're waiting for the child to ask you to learn something, and if they don't, then you don't teach them. I'm not immediately interested in arguing about the pros and cons of different educational approaches. I haven't really got the expertise, but what Catholic home educators have in common and what motivates them when choosing what curriculum to use is the understanding of those four things, their importance: purity, beauty, order and discipline. They're at the centre of Catholic life, in every area of Catholic life. For any education to succeed, it's essential that it shouldn't be contradicted in word or action by those teaching it. A Catholic school, for example, which makes an attempt to educate children on the Catholic teaching on marriage, if such a thing were possible, but whose teachers are all living lives of open scandal, will make very little headway in impressing its pupils with the importance of taking that teaching seriously. So when we attempt to instill in our children the importance of beauty and purity and order and discipline, it's of paramount importance that the environment in which we teach them reflects those things. If the practical reality of home life contradicts the spiritual realities that we're trying to impart, if it's chaotic, dirty, disordered and uncomfortable, we'll fail at a fundamental level in passing those things on. Feminism has succeeded so effectively in destroying the housewife and, with her, the skills she possessed, that very few women have received them intact from their mothers and grandmothers. Where housewifely skills have been taught, in general, it has been more in the nature of a hobby, the occasional baking of a cake, the fleeting and faddish interest in one craft or another, and not the sustained effort of work and creativity that go into creating a well-kept and well-prepared home. Sometimes, and in my view even worse, fake crafts have replaced genuine crafts to occupy children. So, for example, where children in the past might have learned bobbin lace, they now make friendship bracelets. Do you all know what friendship bracelets are? There's just bits of string and you knot them together to make these little bracelets. Where they would have learned darning and the more advanced skills of embroidery and cut work, the results of which decorated the homes of our grandmothers and great-grandmothers. Even the most basic and impoverished home would have had these hand-embroidered tablecloths and so on. But children now are encouraged to play with beads that melt when you iron them and make little kind of mosaic patterns. They're fake crafts which they don't have any wider application. They're not teaching a skill. They can't be used for anything except the making of this one quite childish, not particularly attractive and useless object. They're pernicious because they've trivialised the importance of true crafts, which aren't, and never have been, simply a way of entertaining oneself and using up time, but rather they're necessary to sustaining a comfortable and elegant and civilised way of life. They've displaced true crafts, many of which are now in desperate straits and on the verge of being lost altogether. Bobbin lace is a good example of that. It used to be the biggest craft guild in Britain, and now there's so few people left who know how to do it. It's tragic. Because so few people retain the skill to practice these crafts, and they struggle to find people interested in learning them. Creating a home means, among other things, rediscovering these crafts which have slipped through the cracks between the generations and making them integral to home life. How to do that is the biggest challenge facing young families. Like most mothers of my generation, I had no homemaking skills at all when I started married life, and almost everything I know I've got from books. Housewifery may be in crisis, but books about caring for the home are booming. I'm sure it's no coincidence. Indeed, seekers after housewifely knowledge are faced with an embarrassment of riches when they visit their local bookshops to find it. And I soon found, as I pursued my researches into housekeeping, that there is a variety of approaches to housework which are often at odds with each other. This phenomenon exemplifies my view that housekeeping should not be taught out of books. Who will teach you to pick the right book? Without an understanding of the purpose and end of homemaking, it's easy to pick an approach almost at random and find yourself worse off than before, because there's a right and a wrong way of approaching housework, and a well-ordered approach is learnt without necessarily articulating the philosophy which underpins it, shaping one's attitudes and reinforcing one's Christian instincts by creating a home in which those things are reflected and supported. It might seem odd to talk about an anti-Catholic approach to housework. In most people's minds, housework has been reduced to a list of mundane chores: empty the bins, do the laundry, sort the recycling, which needs a book all of its own. clean the bathroom. And how can there be a Catholic and an anti-Catholic approach to doing that? But housekeeping is a great deal more than that. Just as running a business can't be reduced to bookkeeping and the 9 to 5. Keeping house is the art of living well. And looked at from a Catholic perspective, it also provides the ordered pattern of our days that can imitate the cloistered life. I think it's worth mentioning the housekeeping philosophies I've encountered, which I consider to be a malign influence on the home, to give you an appreciation of what is at stake in this matter of the importance of housework. The most pernicious, in my view, is the Marie Kondo approach contained in the Life-Changing Magic of Tidying. I don't know if anyone's read this book. Yeah. It's amazing. It's a kind of craze for this book. Lots of people have found it very helpful in decluttering their houses. That's what it's about. It's a way of decluttering. And the author is Japanese, and I think it's probably a long way away, probably based on kind of Zen philosophy. It's true that it's much easier to keep house successfully if your house isn't full of rubbish. But the guiding principle of this particular book is that you should keep nothing unless it sparks joy. And the way you find out if it sparks joy is you hold it in your hands, and you have to do this with everything. I mean, with your photograph albums, you have to take each individual photograph out and do it. You hold it in your hands and you close your eyes and you wait. And if you get a fizzing feeling of happiness, you keep it. If you don't get that fizzing feeling of happiness, it goes in the bin. Unless it's the mortgage. There's an exception for mortgage agreements and things like that, where you put them in a folder. That is a very mistaken principle. There are lots of reasons, obviously, for keeping things, apart from whether it makes you feel all happy inside when you hold it. For example, you might have an obligation to the person who gave it to you. It might be an heirloom, really to be guarded and passed on, not morally yours to dispose of. It might be beautiful. It might be a blessed object. That's something which I really wouldn't expect her to take into account. It might be a record of the past. So Marie Kondo advises her followers to treat these objects they're dealing with as though they are people. So you've held the thing in your hand and you close your eyes and it doesn't produce this fizzing feeling. So it's going to go in the bin. But before you put it in the bin, you have to thank it. You thank that object for its years of service. And you do a little bow. Now, in my experience, if you start treating objects like people, you'll end up treating people like objects. And that is exactly what has happened to the people who've taken this philosophy really seriously. People who've got really into this book and they've emptied their houses and there's nothing left, they then look round and they think, well, what about the rest of my life? What about my husband? I'm going to get rid of him too. I know you laugh, but this is what Google it and you'll see. People they condo their whole lives. They get rid of their families, they get rid of their jobs, they go off and find themselves in India. Now, the other issue apart from that is that this book isn't really about keeping house. It's about emptying your house. So if you find a blouse that's got a button missing, you should throw the blouse away. And she doesn't want you to bother doing the drying up. She says, put it outside until it's dried naturally and then put it away. And you should not store any sheets. You should only have the ones on the bed. Now, we live in a society where there is a vacuum, where housewifely skills used to be, and people's homes are in chaos as a result, and they don't like it. But because feminist principles have still had this grip, learning to keep house is not seen as an acceptable solution to this. And the Marie Kondo thesis is filling that gap. Now, it's pernicious for these reasons I've already mentioned, but it's also created in people's minds the idea that the ideal house is an empty house. And every parent, and especially homeschoolers, is surrounded by mountains of Montessori sensorial materials and textbooks and craft equipment. At some point is going to feel the attraction of that minimalist house with its empty shelves, because you shouldn't have more than 50 books. No more than 50 books. No more than 50 books. Blank surfaces everywhere. One ornament surrounded by a kind of ocean of space. But we need to reorder our ideas about what the ideal home looks like. We need to fight back against society's imposition of this false ideal. It's a fake. It's completely sterile. And it has nothing to do with providing a home, a loving and comfortable home for its occupants. How can a house with no spare sheets ever offer hospitality to an overnight guest? How can a house with no books inform and educate the people inside it? How can this minimalist paradise ever feel like home? Will it not rather present the menacing suggestion that family and friends are rather present on sufferance? And if they should fail to spark joy, they'll be out on their ear, along with the family furniture. Furthermore, the destruction of so much that makes up the contents of a normal household means living in a sealed moment of the present. Mementos of the past are not kept, and the history of family life is not passed on. We should not punish ourselves for having homes full of books and toys and furniture. The point of the care of the house is to serve and honour the people who live in it and visit it, to make them comfortable. Chaos is obviously undesirable, leaving as it does to waste and discomfort, but so too is a puritanical style of housekeeping that puts the cleanliness of the home above the comfort of its occupants. Another approach which I think is unhelpful might be called the unrepentantly chaotic mother's approach. I don't think it's got an official name, but the book that I read about it was something similar to that. It's a guide to life, not just the housekeeping, and it takes a very materialistic line. So rather than identifying the most important work and ordering your time accordingly, this approach asks you to work out how much time you're wasting on the phone, for example, or on social media, and you reduce it only by that amount of time that you want for other things. So this approach turns the Catholic idea that our time belongs to God, and we have an almost sacred obligation to make the best use of it on its head. And not only that, it puts self-interest at the centre of the schedule. Time is spent according to the whims and pleasures of the housekeeper, the so-called housekeeper, and the needs of the family are given no weight at all. So a Catholic approach to housekeeping and homemaking would, of course, avoid these colossal man-traps. Structure, routine and prayer give order and shape to the day. Cleanliness and tidiness are given their due importance. But mess-making activities, in the interest of education, are freely permitted with no guilt attached. Certain places, such as the parents' bedroom, for example, are kept tidy and free from mess and toys and dirt at all times. Certain times, such as meal times and prayer times, require all family members' quiet and respectful presence. Above all, the care of the housewife is to provide a loving, serene and comfortable environment for the family, where Christian virtues can be cultivated and practiced. I know that many people assume that families, and large families in particular, live in a state of permanent noise and chaos, at least when everyone's at home. Many people have told me that it must be chaos in my house. I wouldn't want to say that noise and dirt were unheard of in my home, but the idea that chaos and noise are inseparable from large family life is wrong and also very corrosive. In that search for the perfect home, which most people are engaged on, children are very definitely seen as a hindrance, not a help. But a Catholic family life, lived properly, for the most part, is tranquil, comfortable and happy. Large families are a witness everywhere they go to the traditional Catholic teaching on the family, but our Catholic homes too can be a witness to those Catholic values of order and beauty which are so central to the faith, a visible contradiction of the ugly, destructive, anti-life ethic of the secularist ideology. The family is under unprecedented attack, an attack which is growing in strength all the time, and to which families are increasingly vulnerable, particularly in the absence of strong leadership from the Church. I'm sure you've all seen among your own friends and family the direct effects of this. I know I have. I've got a pet theory. I've got no evidence for this at all. But see what you think. That one factor which contributes to family breakdown, not perhaps the most important factor, perhaps not even a decisive factor, but I think it weighs in the balance without people even realising, is that people feel dissatisfaction in their family life because of its discomforts. The home is uncomfortable and uncared for. It's a place to be avoided. Everyone is looking for a home, particularly adult children of divorce, looking for that place of comfort and rest and not finding it. The attack on the family is being made on a multiplicity of fronts, and one of those is the physical home itself. Re-establishing the honour of the housewife is an essential part of winning the war against the state's power grab of parents' moral authority over their children. It also guarantees the existence of homes where Catholicism can be practiced and passed on, where it is visible to all visitors, a public sign of the beauty and permanence of our beloved faith.